All right, very good. We're going. Thank you, Ido.
So may I go on now? So my name is Ido Oren. I know at least some of you. Just to kind of date myself, I'll just say a few words and then let's open up the floor for any questions you may have, and I'll do my best to address them. So to kind of date myself relative to the events covered in the film, I was born in Tel Aviv, Israel in 1958. So in March of 1969, when Golda Meir becomes prime minister, I was basically 10 years old and sort of came of age during her tenure. By the time she steps down in April of 1974, I was, I think, in 11th grade in high school. Okay, so this is just for you to kind of date me relative to these events. And like one brief comment, there are those leaders who during their tenure are heavily criticized by their contemporaries, sometimes even subjected to ridicule, only to be sort of redeemed. And they're stuck appreciate in the eyes of future generations, including historians and commentators. In the United States, I think Harry Truman may be a good example of this dynamic. And in Israel, actually, Golda's predecessor, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, may be a good Israeli example. He was sort of mocked and ridiculed during his 5-year tenure as prime minister. He was indecisive and so on. But over time, historical judgment has become kinder to him. Golda represents sort of the opposite dynamic. Leaders who were, in the words of one of the interviewees, adored, admired, even revered during their tenure, only to be taken off their pedestal. In her case, even toward the end of her tenure, and her stock really depreciated quite precipitously from 1973, 74 onward. And I would say it hasn't recovered to this day. In Israel, it may be different in the United States and among American Jews, but in Israel, again, her stock tumbled. And I think that the film does a pretty good job of giving you an idea of why that is the case. So I'll stop here, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments you may have and see where that'll take us. I should also mention, in case you don't know me, I'm a faculty member of the Department of Political Science at UF.
Can you hear me?
I can hear someone. Is it Jack?
It's Jack.
Yes, hello, Jack.
Hi. It's funny, but it's the second time I've seen the film, and I really do like it, even more the second time than the first time. But one thing I do disagree with you. I mean, whatever goes on in Israel is one thing, but the film itself is virtually idolizes her, virtually. It's a very positive spin on Golda. And, as an interesting, powerful, she's very intelligent, very articulate, and very impressive. I remember seeing Ulpan once, and my very brilliant Ulpan teacher talked about Golda so disparagingly. She said she was a disaster, peace went nowhere, this went nowhere. But I thought the film took a very different perspective in the end. It was, Orievneri, okay. leave him out for a moment. And but for the rest, the filmmakers seem to be very positively disposed towards her.
Jack, I would certainly agree with you that the quality of the film, the filmmaking is high. I too enjoyed the film, so I was not commenting on the filmmaking itself, but I guess I did not read. I think it's empathetic. It's an attempt to understand her and what happened. But I think it's not just Uri Avneri, who certainly was one of her, major critics during her lifetime and during her tenure, but there were quite a number of other speakers, including folks who worked with her and for her, who were quite critical. Even the head of the Mossad at the time, General Zamir, he's the one who at the beginning of the film says, "I adore her." But at the end, he's highly critical. He doesn't mention her name. He puts it like all of us, and not without justice. So her whole generation, we were sort of drunk with power. We didn't want to give an inch of the land of Israel. We were smug, but so he puts it kind of in general terms, but it's very much also an indictment of her.
As we, not her, her.
What? He was there.
I have a comment. I'm curious what you think of this take. The film sort of struck me, among other things, as saying, retrospectively from 2019, that here was this lost chance for peace from 69 to 73. And I wonder if that's sort of reading backwards, that from 69 to 73, Israel had gone from this country that seemed in danger of being destroyed in 1967 to a country that seemed very overbearing in the early 1970s, not necessarily from its point of view of itself, but to everybody else. The Europeans pretty much abandoned Israel. This is the West Europeans. De Gaulle was trading with the Arab states in arms. Willy Brandt essentially wanted nothing to do with Israel. He was willing to fall on his knees at the Warsaw Ghetto, but he really didn't want to go to Israel for worry of destroying Germany's business ties with the Arab states. Terrorism was sort of everywhere. Nixon was the only one who was willing to send arms in 1973, and he had to send them over German objections. And so I'm wondering if her look, it's us against, it's us against the world, like it was in 1948, was not seemingly an accurate read. I mean, why would you trust Nasser? And where was the evidence, the very clear evidence that Sadat was not just, sort of following in Nasser's steps. The same Nasser who said after the defeat in 1967, we're going to just wipe Israel off the map. So as a kind of a long way of getting to my question, but I wonder if this is sort of hopeful, backward reading from, several decades later. Anyway, I'm just curious what you think of that.
First, let me say, I'm not a historian. I'm not in terms of my scholarship and research, I'm not a student of Israel and Israeli politics.
Yeah,
I didn't do archives, so, yeah. but quite a number of the interviewees were folks who were very much at the center of the politics and the policy making at the time, and were part of the inner circle of Golda. And when they reflect back, now I detected sort of a bit of a range of views on the extent to which she was willing to pursue overtures toward peace, from the notion that she was a total refusnik and wouldn't even give anything the light of day, to a kind of a more charitable interpretation that, yes, she was willing to do some exploration, but as I don't remember who exactly the speaker was who put it this way, but he said something to the effect that it wasn't like in her heart. It's not something that she pursued with any conviction or passion. It wasn't on her agenda. And in that regard, again, she was part of, and as prime minister, fueled that general euphoria and feeling that sentiment of arrogance and of smugness that, you know, in 1967, by the way, I was then in like third grade in 1967, but I still remember vividly the few weeks prior to June 5th, the outbreak of the war, and there was all doom and gloom, and, you know, the Jewish state may be ending, and we are being driven to the sea, and we need, you know, cemeteries, graveyards for tens of thousands of casualties, to a few days later, this great burst of euphoria. We are a superhero. We wiped out the entire Arab world in 6 days. And that sense of that kind of tilting all the way to this euphoria carried over and stayed kind of the general state of mind of Israel in those years. And against that backdrop, there was a sense that there's no urgency, time is working for us. And when, for example, Nahum Goldman, who was a major Zionist leader, but not part of Labor, gets a feeler and invitation from Nasser, come visit. And Golda, you saw the footage, was all up in arms and you're not going. So look, it is quite, and Sadat actually went further and sent serious overtures, made serious overtures to Israel. I want the Sinai back for peace. And she would have none of it. And 3,000 deaths later, and many thousands of wounded, and thousands, a whole generation whose heads and psyches are traumatized and still live to this day. They're in their 70s with the traumas of that war. That's exactly what Sadat got a few years later. So we cannot know what might have happened had she said, instead of, no, we're not negotiating on this deal, say, let's explore it further. Let's start a secret channel in Oslo somewhere and see maybe, we can take it forward. She didn't. And so history has been harsh with her for that. There's a whole generation that has been killed or wounded physically or mentally by that war. It was a huge trauma.
Can I add something to the argument?
Of course.
No, I don't want to take up all the time, so there's someone else, then I'll stand back.
I think there was a hand somewhere, but it disappeared. So if not...
Well, all right. So...
you're the boss, Jack.
I want to get back to fighting with you. Interesting. Who comes out looking really good in the film? Nixon, my hero.
Yeah.
he looked so good, so articulate. I mean, how times have changed. It's quite amazing. Yeah. But also interesting what they left out of the film. So Moshe Dayan is seriously downgraded in the film. And Ariel Sharon, you have to look hard to see him. But the counterattack and the capture of the west of the Suez Canal, there's no mention of him. It's like Golda's. She's the one who did it, which I found very interesting. I mean, it's like but here's what I want to argue with you. She's portrayed as very intuitive, and she makes her decisions based upon intuition and logic. Why would someone do X? Why would someone do Y? It's really quite interesting in terms of her, statesmanship of how she makes her decision. I thought it was quite convincing to me. And anyway, that's what do we ever know when we're negotiating with someone, especially on matters of life and death? What do we really know?
There was I was amazed to see that, it was a very brief moment in the film where one of her two sisters actually spoke. So she had two sisters, one like her, made Aliyah, immigrated to, I think, Palestine. I don't know the exact year it happened, probably shortly after Golda. And then it was mentioned that Golda attended the funeral the day of the funerals of the athletes who were killed in Munich. But she had another sister who remained in the United States. And she said something to the effect that, I was trained as a psychologist. And so you're kind of trained to try to put yourself in the shoes of somebody else and try to, if not sympathize, at least empathize, to try to see the world through their eyes. And she was very critical of her sister for not being able to have this concept, right? Maybe I should try to put myself in Nasser's shoes. I found that really a striking.
And she says, "Why should I?
Film.
Why doesn't he put himself in my shoes?" She thought it was a wonderful.
And it ties to also comments. Whether I know for you, it's like perhaps a comment from Satan, but Uri Avneri said something to the effect that, I think it was Uri Avneri, or someone said something to the effect that she had no curiosity, no interest in anything Arab. It was like foreign to her. She was not alone in that.
Could I interject something? It's Lynn Holt.
Hi, Lynn.
Yeah. Hi, how are you? The rigidity that came out in that respect, and also in how she dealt with Egypt, also came out with the Mizrahi Jewish protests. And I thought that was something I didn't know about her at all. And it was rather striking that she couldn't really understand where they were coming from either. Could you comment on that?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Lynn, for actually bringing it up. So I would say if the main issue that accounts for the sort of downgrading of her, historical stock has to do with the legacy of the Yom Kippur War, and her rigidity with regard to potential explorations of peace overtures. The second, but also important issue for which she sort of lost a lot of points in the eyes of historians and commentators, are precisely as you indicated, that episode of her response or lack thereof, and lack of empathy, much less sympathy for the plight of those Black Panthers. And it's quite tragic because, well, part of her tragedy, as I think the film made clear, is that, as Uri Avneri said, had she retired in 1972, she would still have been idolized, in part for her accomplishments in the 1950s. She served for a pretty long time as Minister of Labor, and she took a central part in creating an amazing welfare state in Israel. And Israel in the early 50s was a very poor country, much, much, much poorer than now. Food was being rationed. And yet, right, the government somehow mobilized the resources to build, housing on a massive scale, and create like a national insurance or social security legislation that she took an active part in. So, but then when she's prime minister, right, so most of the immigrants who came, especially later in the 1950s and the 1960s, came from North Africa, especially Morocco. And it was primarily these immigrants or descendant of immigrants from North Africa who were the core of this Black Panther movement that started in that neighborhood in Jerusalem. So that used to be like right on the border before the reunification of Jerusalem in 1967. And the one sentence that remains etched that's always almost automatically associated with Golda in a negative way. She said, they're not nice. Right? Now, maybe it's unfair to her. Maybe she didn't mean in that context, but that's sort of, in terms of the kind of historical perspective on her, that is etched in the historical memory, how they're not nice. And she had basically no ability to see. You could see the document, it was translated to English, where they had a list of demands, and Reuven Abergil, who was one of the leaders at the time, was interviewed extensively, and he says, but we didn't come to her to talk about our personal trouble. Like, she could write a little note to some bureaucrat and they'll arrange it for a job or an apartment for us. We came, you know, advocating for a more systemic change. And they had specific demands that are in the spirit of the welfare state that she was instrumental in constructing in earlier years. And yet, like free daycare from age 4 or something. And she didn't want it, you know, she had no sympathy. So I would say that's almost as much as the trauma of the Yom Kippur War, or second only to the trauma that is responsible for the depreciation of her appreciation, if I may say so. Yes, Rick.
Yeah, to what degree was there disappointment because she played a role in the Labor Party losing power after so long a period?
Good question. So it's interesting, it was mentioned in the film that when she became prime minister in, I think it was March of 1969, and then in late 1969, there was an election, and she goes to Washington. That's when, as Jack or others mentioned earlier, Nixon, you know, she's received like almost like royalty by Nixon. She goes to visit Milwaukee. She comes home with the Phantoms, you know, which are the most advanced jet fighters at the time. And the Labor Party, which was at the time like a recent amalgamation of 3 separate like labor factions, gets 56 seats out of 120 in the parliament, which is the most any single party ever achieved in elections since 1948 in Israel. So like an amazing electoral accomplishment. As you saw, she steps down and walks out of the room in April of 1974. And she is then succeeded by Yitzhak Rabin. So Yitzhak Rabin was, you know, a decorated soldier. He was the chief of staff in 1967. And in 1973, he had the virtue of, he actually was in Washington as Israel's ambassador to Washington. So he was not tarnished, you know, directly or tarred by the colossal intelligence failure and the fiasco of the war. So he becomes Israel's first Sabra, you know, Israel-born prime minister in 1974. And then in 1977, which is quite striking relative to the standards and the ethics of today, it was discovered, it was leaked to the press that he had $2,000, he and his wife, in a bank account in Washington. That was in violation of the very strict, you know, monetary policy or exchange, you know, capital exchange policy and law at the time. And as a result of this scandal, he resigns. And so there's...
And who leaked that information?
I don't know, but I do remember who the newspaper and the journalist who had the scoop. It was Dan Margalit, that's his name, and it was in Haaretz. Dan Margalit was then like a, what's his name from the Washington Post, Bernstein, and you know, like, you know, a young reporter who all of a sudden became a star. as a result of it. And so in 1977, against the backdrop of the trauma of the war, there's also hyperinflation, right? Because basically the war, and after the war for several months until the disengagement deal that was negotiated by Henry Kissinger went into effect, the Israeli army, and that means reserves, hundreds of thousands of reserves remain mobilized. And so it paralyzes the economy. And they basically finance the cost by essentially printing money. And so inflation begins to rise quite steeply. And so basically two events are responsible, I would say, account primarily for that. In Hebrew, they call it mahapach, the, how would you say?
Evolution.
Revolution?
Overturning.
The overturning of labor, the end of 29 years, actually, if you start from 1930, even the pre-States Day, like 5 decades of labor hegemony come to an end with Menachem Begin's and Likud victory in 1977. So it wasn't Golda directly who lost power for labor. It was actually Shimon Peres was the labor candidate. Shimon Peres, kind of the eternal loser. Was already smelling the roses of he was becoming prime minister, and they lost to Begin. And Begin was carried to power, and that relates to the question of the Black Panthers and the Mizrahi Jews, largely on the back, so to speak, or the ballots of the Mizrahi Jews, the North Africans, and other Jews who came from other parts of the Arab world. So the trauma of the war, plus the alienation between labor and the kind of Mizrahi masses who migrate en masse to Likud. And to this day, the main basis of support of Likud is in the towns and in the neighborhoods where, the Mizrahi Jews predominate. Other comments or questions? I'm trying to identify who's speaking.
It's okay. I was about to go ahead. I have something to say, but I'll wait.
Are you talking to me?
I'm talking to you.
Just the irony. There was a Golda quote that I loved from 1938 when she was at the Avion conference with the Jewish Agency, and this was the conference when they were figuring out what to do with Jewish refugees in Europe, and everybody said, "Oh God, this is awful, but we're not taking them." And she said, I hope I'm not butchering this, but I hope I live long enough to see the day when no one feels sorry for us." And the irony is she did live long enough. So, what did you think? I'm curious if you didn't know anything, you would have come away from the film thinking that, Begin was the great peacemaker, and there was Camp David, but I found the juxtaposition between her and Begin to just be a little bit odd, as if there was no invasion of Lebanon in 1982 or something like that. And I realize the movie can't go that far, but if you had known nothing going into this movie, I think you would have had sort of a distorted picture. I'm curious what you thought of that.
Make two comments. One is, I think you're drawing a correct parallel. Now, the movie ends basically with her death in 1978, when, at the age of 80. So, but there is an interesting parallel that you were alluding to, Noam, between how, as you could see in the film, after the Yom Kippur War, she basically just, she was already worn out. You could see that, her health was faltering. She was diagnosed with lymphoma in the 1960s and other ailments, but after the war, she basically no longer had the passion and the energy and the drive to she couldn't take it anymore. And so she convened that meeting that you saw and spoke very briefly and walked out of the room. And as I said, no one walked after her to like try to perhaps make her reconsider. So what happens with Begin, he basically, that was, so in 1982, there is an assassination in London. Oh, he wasn't killed, but badly wounded. The Israeli ambassador to London was killed by a Palestinian terrorist organization in London. And Israel used it as a pretext to invade Lebanon and basically try to wipe out by the 1980s, Lebanon has become the center and the major locus of operations of the PLO. They were driven out of Jordan in 1970, so they moved their headquarters and apparatus to Lebanon. And so here's an opportunity, a pretext to, initially the Israeli public was told, oh, this is just 40 kilometers, just, a limited operations. And before you know it, Israeli tanks are like on the runway of the Beirut airport on the southern outskirts of Beirut a few days later. And initially, that war enjoyed pretty widespread support. There certainly was dissent, but it was pretty popular. But then it becomes sort of a stalemate, and Israeli boys start getting killed and coming home in coffins, and Begin, partly because of that human toll, and I think partly because to at least some extent he was led astray, he was deceived by, someone mentioned earlier, Ariel Sharon, who was the Secretary of Defense and also the Chief of Staff, Rafael Eitan, and he just basically can't take it anymore, and he retires and he dies a short time later in seclusion. He clearly suffered from deep depression. So in that regard, I think you can definitely see some parallels between how the Yom Kippur War affected Golda, and she couldn't take it anymore, and then Begin's depression. But on the issue of peacemaking, I think, as much as I never voted and never supported Begin, you have to give him the historical credit that I think he deserves. As one of the speakers, Yossi Beilin, said, it's probably the most consequential and the most important event in the history of Israel foreign policy is the peace agreement, the Camp David Accords with Egypt. And when it was actually, here's an interesting story, Moshe Dayan, who was a stalwart of labor and Secretary of Defense under labor in Golda's government in 1973. In 1977, after Begin's victory, he defects, and Begin invites him to become secretary, the foreign secretary, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Dayan accepts it, so he defects to Likud, and perhaps out of a sense of guilt, but he actually starts takes part in a secret channel in Morocco of talks with officials of the Egyptian government. And then Sadat, one bright day, makes a statement, I'm ready to come to Jerusalem. Okay? And Begin, I think it was in the Knesset, says, Ahlan wa sahlan, you're welcome, come to Jerusalem. And when this was another fascinating moment in the film, how Golda is in Boston, right? And that Coletta Vital, I guess, was the Israeli consul at the time in Boston. And she tells her, well, I was late because I was listening to the news. It's mind-boggling, it's mind-blowing. And Golda refused to believe it. And there's no way Golda would have pursued this overture. Right? And she said they deserve an Oscar, not the Nobel Prize. So you have to give Begin the credit that he deserves for pursuing.
Could you explain? I didn't quite understand why he was saying this. I thought it was a wonderful phrase, was still a little bewildered why he said they deserved an Oscar.
If I understood correctly, it was Golda, according to, I think it was Yossi Beilin, I'm not 100% sure. It was Golda who said Begin and Sadat deserve an Oscar, not the Nobel Prize. In other words, she was still skeptical. So, you know, she remained, you might say, a refusenik. It wasn't consequential anymore. She wasn't in power. Maybe thankfully, I would say. It's my view.
This is Heath. I don't remember exactly where it was, but there was a big jump in time in the telling of her, the chronology of her life. And one of the things that I don't recall being mentioned in the film is where she was during the 40s, during the Holocaust, and how that affected her view of protecting Israel as a home for, you know, as a Jewish state.
I unfortunately don't have a precise answer, but I can tell you that she basically became committed to a political career from, I think, like the late 1920s. She started as her first job, or her first kind of political opportunity was as head of the Female Workers Council. This was part of the Histadrut, which was part of the informal government of what you can see as a state in formation. And then in the 30s and 40s, I think in the early 30s, she spent a couple of years in the United States. She was sent, as an emissary, maybe fundraiser. And then basically climbed, so I don't know the exact positions that she held, but she sort of climbed through the ranks of the Histadrut and the Jewish Agency, which were kind of the two main organs of that sort of potential or government information. I know that it's so, Noam mentioned, and it was mentioned in the film, in 1938, so that's just before the Holocaust, right? She was at that very sad, tragic, conference in Evian, I think it's in Switzerland or France by Lake Geneva, where, a whole bunch of countries met to discuss the plight of the Jewish refugees in Europe, and only the Dominican Republic of all these countries was willing to truly accept a significant number of Jewish refugees. And that clearly was sort of seared into her consciousness. But I'm afraid I don't know what positions exactly she held during the Holocaust. I can tell you that just more generally in the 1940s, like during World War II, and especially in the first couple of years, when Nazi armies were basically led by General Rommel, were marching through North Africa and reached basically the Egyptian desert. In El Alamein, they were stopped in 1942, which is in kind of the western part of Egypt. But there was serious worry, that Palestine too would be run over by the Nazis. And I remember my father telling me about Italian, fascist Italian bombers flying over and bombing Tel Aviv in the early years of the war. But generally, and especially as the war progressed, the Jewish Yishuv, it was the Jewish community in Palestine, was actually quite prosperous. Life went on, and in fact, because of the demand created by the war, like the British Army, with a major presence in Egypt and Iraq and parts of the Middle East, needed supplies, equipment, uniforms, stuff like this. So actually, at least in terms of economic activity and prosperity, it was a pretty dandy time in Palestine. So, but that's not in any way a commentary on Golda as a person. And again, I don't know what position she.
Yeah, that's all helpful perspective, though.
Yeah. But one interesting tidbit that's maybe worth mentioning, and it may have been, yes, I think it was mentioned in the film, in 1948, 49, for a short period, she actually was Israel's ambassador to Moscow. There's a famous picture of her outside the Choral synagogue in Moscow on Rosh Hashanah, I think, of night. So it was, must have been like around September 1948, with a big crowd of Jews who she was surrounded by them outside the synagogue. She was like all of her generation of Zionist leaders, she was totally secular, almost never set foot in a synagogue, wouldn't know what to do in a synagogue. But still, it's interesting that that iconic moment was outside the synagogue in Moscow. Rick.
Yeah, in 2004, I arrived in Cairo to start working for the US government. And the first week that I was there, they had the Sinai holiday. I said, Sinai holiday, what's that? They said, well, that's when Egypt won the war against Israel in 1973. And I was kind of taken aback because I never looked at history that way. And I was wondering, to what degree did Israel under Golda Meir see that as a defeat?
Good question. I think if you compare, of course, 1973 to 1967, the Six-Day War, in 1967, there was really very little doubt who won and who lost. And even with a lot of, spin doctoring, it would be hard to make a convincing case that, Egypt and Syria and their allies won. 1973 was more ambiguous, and especially if after about a week of the war, so a few days into the war, that's when Golda was ready to board the plane and fly to Washington and, beseech Henry Kissinger and Nixon, who was by then, drinking and busy with Watergate, plead with them for help, because within a few days, Israel lost about 1/3 of its armored corps and 1/3 of its air force. So it certainly is true, and I think it's quite plausible to think about it overall as an Israeli victory if you look at the battlefield outcome on October 23rd, 24, when finally a ceasefire was achieved. Because as you pointed out, in the Sinai, Israeli troops crossed, and led by General Sharon, crossed the canal and created quite a large, bridgehead on the western side of the canal. But then a chunk of the Sinai remained. That's what Golda referred to, how we are here and they are there, and there, a part of Sinai remains still under Egyptian control by, along the sort of northern sector of the canal. And in the Golan, Israel managed to basically push the Syrians back to the, status quo border, and then carve out a sort of an enclave or push toward Damascus. So in terms of the battlefield outcome, I think, you can make, and certainly Israel made the convincing case that yes, we won. But if you look at the broader picture, particularly from Egypt's perspective, then Sadat managed to sort of upset the status quo and start a political process that he tried in earlier years without success to start, and he got back the Sinai all the way to the last inch. Right? So if you look at it that way, it's not without any justification that they celebrate the war. And I guess we should give even Golda credit where it's due, and some of the speakers, you know, recognized and acknowledged it properly, that once she got that phone call at 4 a.m. on the morning of, it was a Saturday of Yom Kippur, where it came from that head of the Mossad, flew to London the day before to meet this super highly placed source from the entourage of Sadat. His name was Ashraf Marwan, and years later he was assassinated probably by the Egyptians for betraying them. He was the son-in-law of the late President Nasser, Ashraf Marwan, and he met Zamir in London on Friday night, and that was like the final, like finally it's incontrovertible that this is an indication of war. And so she was woken up at 4 a.m. And for that morning through the, 3 weeks of fighting, you have to give credit where it's due. She was a rock, she was level-headed, especially in comparison to someone like Moshe Dayan, the great decorated war hero who basically, fell into a funk, started talking about, using nuclear weapons, the nuclear option, and, the third temple is about to collapse. She was much, much more, rock solid and level-headed, and deserves credit for running the war in a very effective way.
This is one scene I really like in the movie when she's walking into a room, and I forget what the room is, had to have something to do with the Labor Party, and there's a portrait of Ben Gurion on the wall, and right next to his portrait is a portrait of Sharet. And it, it's this interesting theme that they could have picked up on, that she's really the last of that founding generation, and Begin was there in 48, but he was still an Irgun terrorist, but she was part of that, the original Ben Gurion cabinet. And now she's sort of the last of the old guard. And in a sense, she really kind of represents that, don't you think? I mean, Ben Gurion and Sharet, they too thought that Goldman was a guy who would give away the farm, and they too argued, if you want to negotiate with us, you have to negotiate bilaterally and acknowledge that we won, and acknowledge that we exist, and all of these sorts of things. But I'm wondering if you saw it that way, that it's not just that she's old, it's that she's part of this this founding generation that maybe gets some things but doesn't get others. I would agree. She's a member of what you call the founding generation, but with the little wrinkle or with a kind of subtle twist. This may be only perhaps the interest of like history buffs and so on, but Zionist history is often told in terms of waves of immigration into Palestine, beginning with the first immigration is in the 1880s, 1890s, and then the second Aliyah Shniya, the second immigration. These are folks like you mentioned, Ben Gurion, Levi Eshkol, the one who succeeded Ben Gurion and died in early 1969 to be succeeded by Golda. Between 1904 and 1914, just a few thousands of highly ideological, committed Zionists from Eastern Europe moved to the then Ottoman. Palestine was under the Turkish or Ottoman Empire rule. And most of them just, the conditions are very rough, and it's hot, and there's no work, and there's hunger. And many of them, return to their home countries or perhaps immigrate to the US, but a hard core somehow remains, and they become really the leadership of first the state in waiting, in the Histadrut, the Labor Federation, the Jewish Agency, and then in 1948, the founders of the state.
So Ben Gurion was one of those who came between 1904 and 1940. Golda is like half a generation later. She immigrates in 1921, which was the Aliyah Shlishit, the third. They were also highly ideological, committed Zionists. You know, the highest ideal was to be in a kibbutz, which is where she wanted to stay, but she had to compromise, as you saw, with her husband. So they left the kibbutz. So, you know, in the overall scheme of things, there was like subtle differences, but these people knew the differences. And, you know, for them, she was like a new generation because she was from the third Aliyah rather than the second Aliyah. But it is significant that her successor, as we already mentioned, Yitzhak Rabin, was the first native born, white Israeli. If there is a person who epitomizes the sabra, that kind of cultural ideal type that Uri Avneri was referring to, he said, well, we're expecting all these immigrants to become superheroes like us. Yitzhak Rabin is the epitome of that, and he's the one who succeeded her. You know, he didn't speak with a foreign accent like she did. For example, he was a native, a general, a farmer. Yeah, and the Begin, then you have another prime minister born in Poland, but from a very different background than the labor leaders. And he only arrives in Palestine around 1940. Any other questions, challenges, objections?
Okay, can you hear me?
Of course.
Okay. No, one of the thoughts I have about the hardness of Golda, the hardness of Ben Gurion too. He was also a tough cookie. Sort of, you know, how much that's part of sort of Israeli statism. That was part of the early history of the state itself. And I also wonder about the connection between that. We think of the connection between that and the Soviet Union or something, or the Bolsheviks or something. But you know, people trying to create a new man and radicalized society. But there are other models for that. And I wonder about about Ataturk. That Ben Gurion spent time in Turkey. He went to law school in Turkey. Ben Tzvi did too. And I wonder how much Ataturk constituted a model for what they wanted to do in Israel.
That's a very intriguing point that you're making, Jack, and I've been wondering about it over the years. I don't know, and I don't have any evidence. I'm not saying there is no evidence. I just don't know enough to tell you that, you know, someone like Ben Gurion directly drew inspiration from Ataturk or held him up as a model to be emulated. But there are very interesting parallels between the state building project of Ataturk in Turkey in the 1920s and 1930s and the Zionist political and cultural project. Very, I think, striking parallels. In particular, a rejection of religion as a basis for, you know, national identity. So in the case of Ataturk, it's Islam, which is sort of domesticated under the state. To say that Turkey was secularized may be an overstatement. Same about Israel, but sort of like creating a secular identity that in direct contrast, counterposed, right, to Islam or to, you know, rabbinical and Talmudic Judaism in the case of Zionism. So it's not that they didn't read the Bible. In fact, Ben Gurion was an avid and careful reader of the Bible, but as a historical document, because we were returning 2,000 years later to the land of our forefathers. And so the Bible is like the historical document that sort of guides us, and we are returning to the places that we are reading about in the Bible. And it was very secular reading. There was no God in it. And the 2,000 years from the biblical time to the present, you know, dark ages. That includes the Talmud.
And the contempt for minorities.
Yeah, that's an interesting parallel too that you I haven't thought about it, but
the population exchange, Istanbul got transformed into, it had been a Greek city or a multi-ethnic city got transformed into a Turkish city.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And if you look at it also, you know, since then, so I would say the heyday, the climax, if you may, of this Zionist project of creating a new Jew, right? The Sabra, the Yitzhak Rabin, the one who in one hand carries a sword and is strong and muscular and a good fighter, you know. It's not going to happen to us again, the pogroms and the Holocaust and so on. And on the other hand, carrying an agricultural equipment. You know, we're returning to the land and speaks Hebrew, in modern Hebrew, not, you know, rabbinic or biblical Hebrew. I'm kind of losing my train of thought.
No, because
so the heyday of this project was 1948, because the generation of Yitzhak Rabin, of Ariel Sharon, or, you know, those who were in their late teens and their 20s, a whole generation was decapitated, like 6,000 of them, in a population of 600 Jews in Palestine in 1948, and they came from this disproportionately from this aristocracy of labor. So the sons of the Ben Gurions and the Sharets and the Ben Tzvis and these pioneers who came to Palestine a few decades earlier. And culturally, so these boys gave us, they died for us. They bequeathed us the state. Then in the 1950s and 60s, as we discussed, Israel absorbed a mass immigration. Many of the immigrants were like Holocaust survivors, refugees from Europe, but an even larger number are Jews from all over the Middle East and North Africa. And they wouldn't melt into the spots that they were supposed to. So take Uri Avneri as an example. He was born in Germany in 1925 as Helmut Ostermann. Helmut. He's still too, you know, even though he arrived in Palestine in the 30s, he was still a boy. There is a bit of a German accent still. You know, he died recently, by the way, after the completion of the movies. He was in his 90s. But, you know, by 1948, he's a Sabra. Even though he was not literally born there, but he completely assimilates himself into this model. He's a fighter. He was wounded in the 1948 war. He speaks Hebrew, he becomes a journalist, he coins, he's not just a Hebrew speaker, he's a trendsetter in, you know, innovation in the Hebrew language and a pioneering journalist. So Jews who came from Iraq and from Morocco and from Afghanistan and, you know, Turkey, they're all supposed to melt into this pot. And many didn't want to, couldn't bring themselves. So they were Jewish first, Israeli second. And just as in Turkey, there has been over the years, and especially in recent decades, a movement of the pendulum away from secularism and that kind of Turkish identity to a more Islamic identity. In Israel too, in 1977 is a major watershed. The pendulum has been swinging from Israeliness, you know, and Sabraness, if you may, to Jewishness, not necessarily in the sense of religious practice and observance, but in a kind of ethno-nationalist way. So very interesting parallels between Israel and Turkey.
By the way, I have one correction I have to make to you.
Sure.
You said if Golda Meir went into a synagogue, she wouldn't have known what to do. That's not true. She would have fundraised.
Okay, yes. That you knew how to do, yes. Schnorr.
Sorry, I couldn't resist.
Yeah, but you know, someone like Yitzhak Rabin, frankly, you give him the Kaddish, he could read it and say it, but it wouldn't sound, and it didn't sound natural.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, because that generation was educated, was socialized into like an Israeli and not a Jewish identity.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly not Jewish in the religious practice sense. By the time I was sort of coming of age in the 1960s, 70s, the word Zionism was already being placed in quotation marks. We were kind of tired of this fuddy-duddy, you know, idealism stuff. And you could hear Golda's sort of disappointment in, you know, the ideas of the past are eroding. People are going after money. They listen to the Eurovision, you know, the Eurovision contest. There's too much Americanization, commercialization. Her attitude to the US is interesting and complex too.
Mm.
I see that. You're welcome, Linda.
We have to mention the films tomorrow.
Everybody, tomorrow the film is Breaking Bread, which is a wonderful film, and our speaker afterwards will be Richard Scher. Many thanks to Ido for leading the discussion tonight. It was truly wonderful, a very nice supplement to the film. Many thanks to Virginia for getting this set up. It wasn't easy. If there are problems, if there were problems logging on with Roku, I'm confident that Virginia will get those straightened out tomorrow. I think sending around the link to the discussion afterwards was probably most helpful.
That was great.
Is there any feedback on that stuff? I'm sure it would be helpful to all of us.
I was getting emails, emails from the server for the film that did not come with a code. And repeatedly did get it with a code. So it was sort of making me agitated.
Well, one nice thing about this is we would get run out of the Hippodrome after 10 minutes of discussion, and now we can actually have a talk, which is kind of nice. So,
if I may, just one final quick comment. Whatever you may or may not think about Golda, I think the choice of the film was very good, and it was I thought a really well done and powerful film.
It's a good film. It's a very good film.
Well, thank you for selecting it.
If I may jump in, this was our first time out for a virtual film screening, so we really appreciate having almost 20 people in a talkback discussion is more than we would normally have in a theater usually. So I consider all things considered, I will say that tonight was a success. Thank you all for pivoting so quickly and making it onto the Zoom call. I really appreciate that. We will do everything we can tomorrow to make sure this goes smoother in terms of the link between the film and the discussion. And for those of you who had issues with not getting your email to log in, we'll look at that. We didn't have the ability to resend a specific film's email, which is sort of a no-brainer. So we'll figure out how that actually works, because we didn't know. But for those of you who interface with William, he is in large part the reason why everybody, got signed up and all that stuff. He's amazing. I typically interface with the distributors and others, but William is the one who interfaces with all of you. So we really appreciate him. And we're really grateful to the Center for Jewish Studies for all that you're bringing to the table with this, with scholars and funding and just being our partner in this year after year. I'm really glad that our 10th festival actually happened. Very grateful to everybody.
To Virginia. Thank you all.
Thank you to everybody. This was great.
Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good night. We'll see you tomorrow night.
Night.
Good night.
Night all.